welcome to the course Social Behavior and the Brain, an Introduction to Social Neuroscience. I am Dr. Ark Verma, an Associate Professor in the Department of Cognitive Science at IIT Kanpur. This is week 7 and we are at the final lecture where we will compare research on anger and violence. So far we have seen that the results indicating that relatively greater left frontal activity is associated with increased approach oriented anger and behaviors that are seemingly inconsistent with evidence suggesting that violent individuals have reduced frontal lobe function. So we are basically seeing that higher anger is associated with greater left frontal cortical activity, but there are also results that say that violent individuals have reduced frontal lobe activation. So these are basically findings that don't go together. So we'll try and understand what is really happening here. Also, there are these and other results that have led some to conclude that the PFC or the prefrontal cortex, particularly the left orbital frontal cortex, is involved in regulation of negative effects like anger. Remember, in the last lecture we were seeing that in some of the experiments, especially the imagery related experiment, there was higher activity in the left orbital frontal cortex when people which was supposed to be involved in inhibition of anger, whereas we are talking about increased left frontal cortical activity when expression and experience of anger. So how are these two things coming together, or whether these two things come together? Let us try and understand. Research has very strongly implicated reduced activity in the right frontal regions with related to violence. So that part is all right. These findings are consistent with the reviewed EEG research that we've looked at so far, which found that approach oriented anger was associated with reduced right frontal activity. Okay, so approach oriented anger, you see, if you remember the last two lectures, we have said approach oriented anger basically manifests as increased left frontal cortical activity and reduced right frontal cortical activity, which is again makes sense. Also, research has revealed that increased activity in the right frontal cortex is associated with withdrawal motivation rather than approach motivation. Okay, so it seems that violent individuals who show reduced right frontal cortical activity in the studies of Rain and colleagues, which we just saw, lack the behavioral constraints engendered by the withdrawal motivation system that may be partially instantiated in the right frontal cortex. So the participants of Rain and colleagues, which actually showed reduced right frontal cortical activity, they basically lacked these behavioral constraints which are engendered by withdrawal motivation. So they were not properly able to withdraw. The withdrawal system was not functioning properly in their brains. Also, more research studies have implicated reduced activity in both left and right frontal cortices with respect to violence and aggression. Now, this is a slightly different finding to what we have been discussing so far in the previous 4 lectures. For example, Rain and colleagues found in a PET study that effective murderers, people who commit a crime of passion, violently murdering somebody because of being overcome by extreme emotion, extreme anger and so on. So effective murderers as compared to predatory murders, who plan and do cold-blooded murders, and normal control. So three parties are compared: effective murderers, predatory murderers and normal controls. They actually evidenced, the effective murderers evidenced reduced lateral and medial prefrontal activity in both hemispheres during a continuous performance task. So it seems that there is the areas that are typically involved in response inhibition and control are seemingly showing reduced activation in these effective murderers as compared to both cold-blooded or predatory murderers or normal controls. Also, differences in participant samples, the ones that we are seeing here, can actually explain the differences in the results. Most of the anger studies have involved typically normal individuals, whereas the studies on violence have involved extremely violent individuals. So remember again that the brain also has a lot of unique and individual properties. Our own experiences throughout our lifetime, our traits and our personality characteristics, all of them will have a bearing on our brain. So if you're comparing two samples, one of normal individuals, one of extremely violent individuals, there are bound to be differences in the activity of the brain. Remember, one of the critical truths about the brain is the fact that there is individual differences not only in terms of functionality but also anatomical differences. Okay, So, in the study by Harman Jones and Allen that we were looking at in the previous lectures, some participants were adolescents who were in an inpatient psychiatric unit for impulse control disorders. Okay, remember we can sort of see that there was this parallel at least. But even amongst this sample of young adolescents who were in an inpatient psychiatric unit, trait anger was related to greater left frontal cortical activity and reduced right frontal cortical activity at rest. So, that part at least is there. These results together suggest that the samples may not be the source of differences. It is not probably that the different kind of sample is causing these differences. It is probably again the design, the task that is there, and some of the other circumstances. The Harman Jones and Allen sample was much younger than samples used in other studies that have been working with violent individuals, and that have basically shown reduced frontal lobe function in violent and non-violent individuals. Remember, brain also has a maturational timeline, and in younger individuals as opposed to older individuals, the properties or anatomical as well as functional properties of the brain are subject to change. So, what point here we are making is that in the Harman Jones and Allen studies that we were reviewing in the previous two lectures, where we saw increased left frontal cortical activity with response to anger expression and experience, cannot directly be compared with some of these later studies. For example, the Rain and colleagues study, where they have actually studied slightly older individuals who were also extremely violent. So, they are comparing effective murderers, they are comparing predatory murderers, and then they are comparing older normal individuals. Okay. So, it does not mean that findings of either of the studies are wrong, but it means that there are basic differences between the kind of sample that they have chosen, and also some other things, that their findings are not essentially comparable. So, the longer lifetime of violence in adults may actually relate to reduction. So, the proposal is in order to reconcile these findings, the proposal is that the longer lifetime of violence in adults may actually relate to reductions in the frontal cortical activity. Now, this is a little bit of a profound statement. I don't want to draw a lot from this, but just remember, what is the frontal cortex doing? It is trying to inhibit, control your responses. If people are in this constant habit of engaging in violence against their impulses, or in under the charge of their influences, under the influence of their impulses, then basically what happens is, if this keeps happening again and again for over a lifetime, then obviously these areas, the areas that are supposed to be involved in behavioral control, response selection and response inhibition, their functionality will reduce over time. Probably they will also show anatomical changes such as a reduction in volume. The studies comparing the brain functions of violent and non-violent individuals typically assess frontal lobe function either at rest or during a cognitive task, and not during anger arousing situations. See, because these individuals are known to be problematic when they are angry, they are known to engage in explicit violence. That is why typically what people have done so far, and again you can see it is a design matter, is that they have assessed their frontal lobe function either at rest, basically when nothing is happening, or during a task that does not have to do anything with anger. And that also could be a reason why their findings are coming different. But it is not really clear that how the reduced frontal lobe function measured during task causes violence. So, how is this related? How is the measured frontal lobe function basically, how can you measure this during tasks that may incite violence and so on? So, let us look at that. The violent individuals as compared to non-violent individuals who display less prefrontal cortex activity during cognitive tasks may simply be less emotively engaged by the relatively unemotional nature of these tasks. See, for violent individuals, you would need a more provocative cue so that they get emotionally charged by these things, and unless they are getting emotionally charged or emotionally involved by these things, their behavior, also their brain activity, will not reveal the kind of patterns, the kind of activations that you are looking for. So, you have to do something about the kind of design that you are implementing, the kind of stimuli that you are using, and the kind of task that you are asking your participants to engage in. Further, the frontal lobe function of violent individuals during a more emotively engaging situation, such as an interpersonal provocation, remember the insult task or the teasing task that we have seen in past, that has not really been assessed, I am sure, because of logistical reasons. It is possible that reduced frontal lobe function might not be seen in these individuals in such a situation where actually a provocative scenario is created. Brain activations during anger inducing events may be more predictive of violent behavior than brain activations during non-motivating cognitive tasks. Remember, anger is an approach motivated task. Anger leads to violence. If the task is not inciting violence, anger and violence will both not manifest in the brain in ways that spur action. Okay. There is another difficulty here, which emerges when attempting to compare studies of violent offenders with the studies on anger. Anger and violence also are different operational constructs, if not conceptual constructs, but they are different conceptual constructs also, but they are also different operational constructs. Anger can be manipulated in the lab. In the lab you can actually make somebody angry or less angry, but in the lab you cannot obviously incite violent, and you cannot manipulate a violent offender that, oh, now you start beating up people and now you stop beating up people, and then we are measuring your brain activity. So the latter correlational studies that have been done are therefore very difficult to interpret, at least in the terms of the theories that we have been seeing so far. So overall, the idea that anger is associated with approach motivational tendencies is supported by behavioral and neuroimaging evidence. However, it is possible that some instances of anger, such as anger mixed with fear, may be associated with withdrawal motivational tendencies. We've seen that in the previous lecture or lecture before that, when we were talking about offensive and defensive aggression. Indeed, in one study, the authors observed such an effect. For example, white individuals in that study prepared to interact with a black person under the guise of an interest in exploring interracial interaction. So they were basically asked to interact on some pretext. In that kind of context, societal pressure dictates that anger should not be expressed. Even if you are getting angry, you are interacting with these black people and you have some racial prejudice towards them, you probably making you angry, but obviously the social norm is to not express that anger. So in this kind of a situation, the experience of anger may coincide with anxiety and a desire to avoid the situation. Cortical activity was measured with white participants. Cortical activity was measured with while white participants anticipated the interracial interaction. So while they were preparing for this interaction, then their cortical activity was measured. Again, consistent with expectations, self-reported anger was associated with anxiety and relatively high frontal activity. Remember, what is the right frontal activity for? It is for suppressing anger. It is for suppressing these negative emotions. Left frontal activity was associated with expressing these negative emotions. So what is basically happening is, these participants are anticipating anger. These participants are anticipating frustration on being asked to interact with these black participants, and that is why what they are doing is they are anxious that how will I behave, how will I turn out, will people know me for being a racial person or not, and in that case what they are also doing is they are over activating their right frontal cortex, which is basically being utilized to suppress this activity. Also, in addition, some individuals may have actually already learned to control their angry approach tendencies and may have instead converted these angry tendencies into withdrawal oriented behavior. So that might also be happening at the same time, depends from individual to individual. So obviously more research is needed to understand whether and how this type of angry expression may emerge or manifest with respect to neural activity. Now, we've sort of discussed anger as a very important emotion. We've discussed whether it is a aspect of valence or whether it is an aspect of approach motivation. There is more that we have to talk about. There's more that we need to try and bring together here. So far, we have understood that approach motivations such as anger involve a range of brain regions. They involve several brain regions. But the reviewed research so far, especially the EEG research, establishes the importance of the left prefrontal cortex in approach motivation independent of affective valence, independent of whether anger is a negative emotion or a positive emotion. That anger is approach related basically causes it to increase activity in the left frontal cortex. Further, in discussions of the function of the prefrontal cortex, researchers have suggested that the prefrontal cortex is involved in higher level cognitive functions such as working memory and inhibitory processes. Now, part of the reason the scientists reserve the prefrontal cortex for higher level cognitive processes is because it is a region that is much larger in humans than non-human animals. See, it is above the brain stem, it is above the older brain, as some people call it. It is one of the most important region of the brain which is involved and which is very different from, I mean, in some sense, at least functionally, very different from other species, both mammalian and non-mammalian. Okay, so it is a region that is much larger in humans, and therefore it is correlated with the higher cognitive intellectual kind of functioning that the humans involve in. Also, the idea of being able to live in a civil society, cooperating, helping each other out, tactfully deciding this and that. So the prefrontal cortex is actually a very, very important region. This logic also continues. For example, if the prefrontal cortex were to be a relatively recent development in evolution, then it must be the source of all of these psychological processes that we are talking about, civilization coming together, farming, all of those difficult sort of thing that we have been doing, and that is what separates us from the other animal groups as well. Now, interestingly, this logic is at least partially correct, but it is not foolproof. There are chinks in this particular logic as well. For example, recent single cell research with rats has revealed that the prefrontal cortex is involved in aggression, and most of the cells activated are not really inhibitory cells. So it seems that it is something that also allows for aggression, and in some cases maybe is not involved in inhibiting all of these things. Again, remember, the prefrontal cortex, we were talking about the left orbital frontal cortex and its function, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. There are differences within the prefrontal cortex also. So we need to understand that the prefrontal cortex is actually a rather vast area. It's a vast territory, and it is likely involved in a number of psychological processes. For example, structures that are involved in certain psychological and behavioral processes in non-human animals may actually be involved in different processes in humans. So you have to also get a sense of that. Also, anatomical details of the components of emotional response circuits are also different in humans and non-human primates. So the organization, the connectivity, and some functions of the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate differ between rodents and primates. We know that. In addition, evidence suggests that areas throughout the brain are activated during a variety of mental processes rather than processes just being localized in one area. So it is basically a network that is working together. The size, the complexity, and the activity of the human prefrontal cortex suggests that it is integrated for many, many processes. All right. Just continuing this, humans are better able to plan behavior and control their responses to emotional stimuli than other animals, and it is the prefrontal cortex that seems to be involved in these processes. However, this planning and execution of behavior is not always in the service of inhibiting destructive motivation. Sometimes it is for spurring actions, spurring kind of aggression, self-defense, and those kind of things as well. For example, some behaviors that are said to distinguish humans from other mammals, such as war and genocide, involve a high degree of planning and control, and it does actually enhance the destructiveness of approach-oriented aggressive motivation. See, we have been living in societies, we have been living in nation states and so on, and there have been wars, there have been so many of these things. There are still wars going on in the present world. So it seems the brain supports this. The brain supports the idea of going on to war to safeguard some interest, for self-defense, for furthering your own economic or political interest. All of that the brain does. So it seems that it is not that the brain is constantly involved in suppressing the violent tendencies. Sometimes it is actually involved in magnifying the destructiveness of the violent approach, and that is also a property of the human brain. Also, research on anger related with asymmetrical frontal cortical activity, when considered in a while, it strongly suggests that the left prefrontal cortex region is involved in more than just the inhibition of negative effect, as some have suggested. So, it is involved in a bunch of things. We are seeing that in the previous 4 lectures. Relative frontal cortical activation has consistently been associated with self-reported state anger and behavioral aggression, and also approach motivated behavior. So, it is not that the frontal cortex is constantly involved in inhibition. The left frontal cortex, for example, is also involved in approach motivated behavior, in behavioral aggression, and in self-reported state anger. So, it does a bit of both, at least if you want to have a holistic picture. Individuals with proneness towards mania and individuals higher in trait anger actually show even greater relative left frontal activation in response to angry events, again something that we have seen already. Moreover, manipulated increases in left frontal cortex activation cause approach related angry, attentional and memory responses. So, while there is this left with this prefrontal cortex, the left prefrontal cortex can be singled out to be involved in higher approach related aggressive actions. Finally, to sum this up overall, even at resting baseline, individuals who are higher in trait anger show relatively greater left frontal cortical activity, and this relationship also occurs in adolescents, which are, for example, remember Harman Jones and Allen study, they were in the psychiatric inpatient units for impulse control. So, if you put all of this together, it would be illogical to actually suggest that all of these individuals are actually constantly inhibiting anger more than the individuals which do not have a high level of state anger, trait anger, approach behavior, aggression or mania. So, it seems that both of these the regions of the brain are sort of involved in both of these capacities. The left frontal cortex is typically involved in expression and experience of anger, whereas the rest of the frontal cortex, the right and the dorsolateral orbital frontal parts, are involved in managing behavior, suppressing and overall providing control. The approach and withdrawal processes that we have been talking about, implemented by asymmetrical frontal cortices, have also been observed not only in humans but in rhesus monkeys as well, as early as 2 to 3 days of age. So, it is something that happens from the start. Also, in addition, damage to these regions of the frontal cortex causes depression versus mania. It does not cause mania, it causes depression. So, people are not able to act out, they are not able to approach, their tendency to approach and act towards things sort of gets diminished. And RTMS manipulations of left versus right cortical region has been shown to affect mood and attentional processing in manners consistent with the idea that asymmetrical frontal cortical activity is actually involved in motivational direction. So, in a sense, if you want to close this, we want to understand that the left prefrontal cortex is involved in approach tendencies, anger yes, but other kinds of approach tendencies as well. Research with organisms, and this has come through several different domains of evidence. For example, research with organisms such as toads has revealed that approach and withdrawal processes are actually lateralized in a manner similar to that is observed in humans. So, here there is that degree of lateralization available. However, interestingly, these lateralizations involve probably more structures than the frontal cortex, which the amphibians do not have. Okay, ours is a more evolved brain, it has several areas and these distinctions between them. So, the lateralization of approach and avoidance is more well defined in the human brain as opposed to the, for example, the toad brain. It is possible that subcortical structures are lateralized for approach and withdrawal motivational processes in amphibians, reptiles and birds, but that these lateralizations are preserved and elaborated into the frontal cortex of the human brain. All right. So, future research is certainly needed to explore the connections between subcortical and cortical structures in both the cases of approach and withdrawal motivation. All right. Now, if you look at all of this along these lines, some research actually suggests that in the left frontal cortex, activations in the left frontal cortex are related to dopaminergic projections from the striatum associated with coordinated action with learning reward contingency. So, it is not really a network that is isolated, but it is connected with, say for example, your dopaminergic connections also. However, it is unlikely that the motivational related activations that are observed in the frontal cortices simply result from just the propagation of these signals from solely subcortical structures, as source lateralization from these EEG studies have suggested that an approach withdrawal related frontal asymmetries actually do reflect changes in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortical activity as well. So it seems that both of these areas are acting complementary to each other. All right. Finally, if we conclude, research suggests that greater left than right frontal cortical activity is associated with approach motivation, but not positive effect per se. Now, in pursuing a better understanding of the role of asymmetrical frontal cortical activity in emotive processes, the research actually sheds a bit of new light on social psychological questions, even outside the realm of social neuroscience. For example, neuroscience questions regarding the emotive functions of asymmetrical frontal cortical activity basically prompted a line of research on anger, one of the most socially important emotive states, but which has interestingly or unfortunately been neglected in major theories of emotion. Major theories of emotion have typically revolved around happy, sad, positive, negative, fear, disgust and those kind of things, whereas anger seems to be a relatively under-researched area. This line of research on anger has demonstrated very clearly that unlike other negative emotions, which are negative affect, negative valence leads to withdrawal, anger is often associated with approach motivational tendencies, which has been the overall crux of this chapter that we've just studied. Consequently, major dimensional theories of attention will actually need to be slightly modified to incorporate the idea that not all negative aspects of affect are associated with a withdrawal motivation. See, when we started this chapter, we were talking about positive affect, approach motivation, negative affect, withdrawal motivation. Here, through the case study of anger, we have understood that not all negatively valenced emotions will always sort of lead to this withdrawal motivation happening. All right. The research on anger suggests that social situations and individual differences also may cause anger to be associated with, in some cases, withdrawal motivation. It's not exclusive in that sense, and this work therefore has very important implications for the understanding of inhibition of aggressive behavior as well as the development and maintenance of anxiety disorders. Sometimes when you are inhibiting certain kinds of behavioral choices, it leads to anxiety, it leads to depression, it leads to other kinds of mental maladies. The research on the emotive functions of asymmetrical frontal cortical activity, which was the subject of study in this chapter, has also been extended to assist in understanding the psychological and behavioral functions of other emotions such as guilt, as well as processes of cognitive dissonance as well. All in all, social neuroscience is an important area of social psychology that has the potential to actually do this, to enhance our understanding of basic psychological issues such as anger and integrate the theories and findings of social psychology as well as other areas of neuroscientific inquiry. So, we will continue doing this. You can see we use some of these social neuroscientific methods to understand very well a particular behavioral phenomena, that is anger. We will continue talking about this in the next lecture. Thank you.